I was halfway through casting my line when I heard the screech. "Excuse me. What do you think you're doing?" I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. That voice could peel paint off a boat hull. "Morning, Clarinda," I said, keeping my eyes on the water. Clarinda Carson, president of the Lakewood Shores HOA, queen of unsolicited complaints and self-appointed neighborhood tyrant. She marched down from her backyard in her usual getup. Oversized sun hat, aggressively floral robe, and that clipboard she carried around like it was an FBI badge. "You can't fish here," she snapped. "This is private HOA property." I reeled in slowly, calm as ever. "Funny, I own this shoreline, Clarinda," she blinked. "Excuse me," I turned to face her, now fully amused. "Bought the whole stretch 2 years ago, from the county auction, remember? Back when the HOA forgot to pay property taxes on the lakeside strip." Her jaw clenched. "That was a clerical error and we filed an appeal." "Well, the appeal didn't go through. Got the deed framed in my garage if you want to see it." Clarinda's face turned the kind of red that makes you wonder if someone's about to explode or cry. "You can't just sit here and fish like it's some swamp shack. This is a peaceful neighborhood." I looked around. Not a soul in sight. "Just me, the lake, and the occasional duck." "It is peaceful," I said, "until you show up." She ignored that and whipped out her phone. "I'm reporting this to the HOA board. You're in violation of community standards." I chuckled. "Clarinda, I'm not part of the HOA. My property and the shoreline was never annexed. You know that." She froze. That was the thing. Clarinda had been trying to quietly fold my land into the HOA for over a year, sent me a fake welcome packet once. Even tried to fine me for a non-compliant fence. She thought if she kept pressuring me, I'd cave and start paying dues. But I wasn't the caving type. And now here she was, screaming at me on land I legally owned, trying to tell me I couldn't fish. "This is harassment, Clarinda," I said, standing up. "You step 1 inch past that marker again, I'll have you trespassed. You wouldn't dare." "I already warned you last month. That was strike 2, her eyes narrowed. "You think you're clever, Bradley? The HOA has rules, lots of them." "You'll slip up eventually," I shrugged. "Maybe, but until then I'll keep fishing on my land. That surrounds your backyard." Her face dropped as the truth settled in. That's right. I didn't just own the shoreline where I stood, I owned the entire arc of land around her lakeside yard. She couldn't even put a canoe in the water without technically stepping on my property. And she just screamed at me in front of her own security cameras. I grabbed my tackle box, tossed the fish back in the lake, and gave her a casual wave. "See you tomorrow, neighbor." The next morning, I found a fresh set of tire tracks cutting across the gravel path to my dock. That was new. I followed them with my coffee in hand, noting how they stopped just shy of the private property no trespassing sign I'd mounted last year. The grass along the edge was flattened in a crescent arc, as if someone had tried to stake out a perimeter. I didn't need a detective to guess who'd done it. When I reached the dock, I saw what she'd left behind. 4 orange flags pinched into the soil, each with a laminated HOA logo and a QR code taped underneath. I scanned one out of curiosity. It linked to a community beautification survey asking residents whether unsanctioned shoreline activities should be banned entirely. I laughed out loud. She was trying to crowdsource a ban on using property she didn't own. I didn't bother moving the flags. Instead, I walked back up to the house and opened the old manila envelope I kept in the kitchen drawer. Inside were copies of the original county auction documents, the certified deed, and a topographical overlay that showed clear boundaries. I added photos of the flags and the tire marks, then emailed everything to my friend Kevin, City Code Enforcement Officer and lifelong fishing buddy. Kevin called back within the hour. "She planted survey flags on your deeded land." "Yep." "Did she cross the property line?" "Stopped right at it." "But the QR codes are a cute touch." There was a pause. "I'll swing by later. That kind of behavior gets real dicey when it comes from a governing board. You know how many HOAs get sued over this kind of stunt? I've got time." I spent the rest of the afternoon replacing the old boundary markers with updated signs metal this time with reflective lettering. I also installed a trail cam in the tree line, angled at the path between Clarinda's yard and the shoreline. If she made another move, I'd have it recorded in high definition. Right around dusk, Kevin pulled up in his city truck. He stepped out, looked around, and let out a low whistle. "She's got guts," he said, squatting to examine one of the flags. "HOA branding on a public survey, that's not just overreach, it's impersonation of authority." She's been getting bolder. "Any idea why now? Not really. But I've got a feeling she's planning something." Kevin stood up, brushing off his hands. "You want me to file a report?" "Not yet. Let's see how far she pushes it." The next day, she pushed. I was in my garage tuning up the outboard motor when I heard chains rattling. I stepped outside and saw two men hauling a section of fencing down the hill from Clarinda's yard, white vinyl, about 6 feet tall with decorative lattice on top. They started installing it along the edge of the lake, on my land. I didn't even get a chance to say anything before one of them noticed me watching. "You the property owner?" he asked. "Sure am," he frowned. "We were told this was HOA common ground. You were told wrong." He scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable. "We already sank 2 posts. That's too many." Clarinda appeared at the top of the slope, arms folded like she was posing for a portrait. "Bradley, we're putting in a privacy fence. It's standard for lakeside properties. On my shoreline, it's for the benefit of the community. You can still access the water, just not through this section. Clarinda, you're trespassing. You hired contractors to build on property you don't own." She tilted her head. "We had a survey done." "By whom?" "Our grounds committee." I stared at her. "Your committee isn't licensed." "That's not a legal survey," she blinked. "It was thorough." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "You're admitting on camera that this fence is going on land not deeded to the HOA based on an unlicensed survey." Without waiting for an answer, I turned to the workers. "Take it down." Now, they looked at each other, then at Clarinda. "We're not trying to get in the middle of anything," one said. "We'll pack up." Clarinda marched down the slope. "You'll do no such thing. That fence is community funded." "Then you're wasting your members' money," I said. "And committing criminal trespass." She froze mid-step, like the words hit her in slow motion. "Kevin's already seen the flags," I added. "He's filing a report." "You can't go around recording people without consent." "Sure I can. It's my land." One-party consent state. The contractors didn't wait for more. They began pulling up the posts and stacking the panels back onto their trailer. Clarinda stood speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a puppet with a broken string. Later that evening, Kevin called again. "She filed a formal complaint with the city," he said, incredulous. "Claims you're interfering with community development." "That even a real category?" "No, but it's going in her file." By the end of the week, things escalated. I found a notice duct taped to my mailbox, no envelope, no postage. Just a sheet of printer paper with a fake HOA letterhead claiming I owed $600 in shoreline usage fees. There was no invoice number, no contact info, just a deadline and a warning that non-payment may result in lien action. That was a mistake. I took the paper straight to the county clerk's office. The clerk scanned it, frowned, and pulled up the HOA's legal filings. There were no approved fee structures that applied to my parcel. More importantly, only the treasurer could issue payment demands, and Clarinda wasn't listed on that signature authority. It was an impersonation of financial authority. A second-degree offense. The county forwarded it to the district attorney. By Monday, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit called to ask if I'd be willing to provide a statement. I told him I'd do one better. I handed over the envelope with all the documentation, plus the trail cam footage because, sure enough, the night before the notice appeared, Clarinda had walked up to my property line with a flashlight and a roll of tape. The detective didn't say much, just nodded a lot and asked for copies. That afternoon, I got a call from someone I hadn't expected, Daryl Atwood, former HOA treasurer. "I heard about the fake invoice," he said. And the flags, listen, I probably should have said something sooner. Said what? She's been pushing for months to force annexation of your land. Even tried to convince the board to approve a retroactive covenant. I refused. That's why I stepped down. I leaned against the porch railing, processing that. She ever mentioned the auction? Only to say the HOA would correct the mistake one way or another. Daryl, that's fraud. I know, I saved the emails. I'll send them to you. Within the hour, I had a chain of messages from Clarinda's HOA address, some of them openly discussing strategies to claim the shoreline for community use. One even suggested creating a maintenance lien for fabricated landscaping violations. She'd gone too far. I forwarded everything to the detective. The next morning, unmarked cars rolled into the neighborhood. Clarinda's house was the first stop from my kitchen window. I watched 2 officers approach her door. She answered in her usual robe, but this time there was no clipboard, just a shaking hand clutching a phone. They spoke for a while. Then they entered the house. When they came out, she wasn't with them. She left in the back seat. It took less than a day for the board to hold an emergency meeting. Daryl was reinstated. The HOA's lawyer issued a statement to the neighborhood clarifying that none of Clarinda's actions had been authorized. They promised a full review of internal processes. I kept fishing. Same spot, same piece. Only now no one dared disturb it. The ripples on the lake had barely settled when the fallout started. 3 days after Clarinda was escorted from her house, a courier showed up at my door with a padded envelope from the county prosecutor's office. Inside was a notice informing me I might be called as a witness in an upcoming grand jury investigation, not just into Clarinda, but into the HOA itself. The letter referenced suspected misuse of community funds, intentional misrepresentation of legal boundaries, and unauthorized attempts to assert dominion over private property. I read it twice, then folded it and locked it in the gun safe under the workbench. Later that same evening, I saw movement across the shoreline. Not from Clarinda's house, it had gone dark since the day she was taken away, but from the house, 2 lots down. A man I barely recognized was walking toward the water with a clipboard, stopping every few feet to jot something down. He wore a cheap windbreaker and cargo pants, and he was alone. When he reached the edge of the old flag placement, he crouched, examined the earth where the posts had been pulled, then looked up and saw me watching from the deck. Instead of waving or introducing himself, he turned and walked briskly back toward the street. By the time I reached the sidewalk, he was pulling out in a gray pickup with no plates. I flagged it with Kevin the next morning. He showed up on his lunch break, this time in plainclothes. "That wasn't one of ours," Kevin said after I described the man. "Might be a private investigator. If the DA's office is digging into HOA finances, they'll want to know if Clarinda was acting alone or if the board helped her." I didn't think HOAs were even worth this kind of trouble. Kevin shrugged. "Depends how much money's involved. Lakewood Shores isn't exactly a lemonade stand operation. They've been collecting dues for over 15 years. That's 7 figures of community funds." I hadn't thought about it like that. It explained a lot. Could she have siphoned anything off? If she did, there'll be a trail. Especially if she used board authority to greenlight expenses. I leaned back against the railing. What happens if they find out the board knew and stayed quiet? Kevin didn't answer right away. He looked out over the lake, then turned toward me. They could lose their charter. If it's bad enough, the county might dissolve the HOA. It's happened before. That stuck with me. I'd always assumed HOAs were permanent fixtures, annoying but immovable. The idea that they could be disbanded entirely, that was new. The next afternoon, I was finishing some work on the boathouse when a knock came at my side door. A woman in her mid-40s stood there, dressed in a conservative blazer and holding a leather portfolio. "I'm looking for Bradley Kolman," she said. "My name's Yvette Monroe. I'm with the district attorney's office." I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't waste time. We're building a case around fraudulent governance, she said, flipping open her folder. Clarinda Carson is facing multiple charges: mail fraud, falsifying official documents, and unlawful attempts to assert property rights over land she didn't own. I nodded. I figured as much. We also believe she may have co-mingled HOA funds for personal projects. There's evidence of a landscaping account that doesn't match any approved budget. She tried to put a fence on my shoreline. That was never approved either. Yvette made a note. We'll need a statement from you, not just about the fence but the pattern of behavior, the fake invoice. The survey flags everything. I gestured toward the kitchen island where a folder already sat. I've been archiving everything in chronological order, photos, documents, even the audio from when she confronted me by the dock. I added timestamps. Yvette blinked, then smiled. You're either very organized or very used to dealing with nonsense. Little of both. She stayed for nearly an hour, reviewing the materials and asking detailed questions. By the time she left, her folder was twice as thick. Before she stepped out, she paused at the door. Just so you know, this case is growing. We've interviewed 3 former board members so far. 2 of them admitted they were pressured into silence. By Clarinda. By threat of fines. She manipulated the HOA's enforcement policy to keep dissenters quiet. I exhaled slowly. That explains how she held on so long. She won't anymore. 2 days later, the neighborhood group chat rarely used except for bake sale reminders exploded. Someone had posted a scanned letter from the interim board announcing an emergency town hall. Not just to address Clarinda's removal, but to open the floor to residents about whether Lakewood Shores HOA should be formally dissolved. I nearly dropped my coffee. The meeting was set for that Saturday at the community center. I showed up early, half expecting to see folding chairs and maybe a dozen retirees. Instead, the parking lot was packed. Cars lined both sides of the street, and people were standing outside the doors waiting to get in. Inside, it was chaos. Neighbors I barely knew were waving papers, muttering in clusters, pointing at copies of bylaws and budget sheets. The interim president, a soft-spoken woman named Teresa, stood behind a folding table trying to keep order. When she finally called the meeting to order, the microphone squealed and a hush fell. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "We know things have been turbulent. But we are here tonight because the residents of this community deserve transparency." She gestured toward an easel with a poster-sized map of the neighborhood. Red pushpins dotted the lakefront properties. One pushpin sat directly on my shoreline. This map represents every property Clarinda attempted to assert control over in the last 2 years. In every case, no legal right existed, and in every case, residents either received unauthorized fines or misleading notices. A man in the front row stood up. "She tried to ban my son from launching his kayak." Another voice shouted, "She fined me for having a compost bin." A third called out, "She told me my lease didn't exempt me from HOA rules even though I rent." Teresa raised a hand. "We understand. That's why we've consulted legal counsel. We have 3 options: reform the board, place the HOA into receivership, or vote for full dissolution." Gasps rippled through the hall. Someone near the back asked, "What happens if we dissolve?" A man in a blue windbreaker stood. "I'm with the county." "If you dissolve, the HOA's assets, funds, common areas, records are turned over to the county for audit. Any remaining funds could be redistributed to members, depending on the audit's outcome." A woman nearby muttered, "About time we got something back." Teresa nodded. "But be aware, if we go that route, there's no going back. We won't have an HOA again unless we form a new one from scratch." I raised my hand. When Teresa called on me, I stepped forward. "My name's Bradley Kolman. I was targeted by Clarinda more than once. She tried to install a fence on land I own. She distributed fake invoices. She harassed contractors and she lied to your faces." I turned, addressing the whole room. "But here's the part that matters. She used fear. Fear of fines, fear of embarrassment, fear of being singled out. That's how she kept everyone silent. I pointed to the map. She wanted this shoreline, not because she needed it, but because she couldn't stand the idea of someone having freedom she couldn't control. Murmurs grew louder. I don't care what option you choose. But I'll say this. If a system can be twisted by one person to hurt everyone else, maybe that system doesn't deserve to keep standing. The room exploded in applause. By the end of the night, the vote was called. Ballots were handed out, people lined up. When the results were read, you could feel the tension snap like a rubber band. Dissolution passed. By more than 70%, the HOA was dead. In the weeks that followed, the county began its audit. Clarinda was indicted on 5 charges, with a 6th pending related to misappropriation of funds. Her name was scrubbed from every official record in the neighborhood. The remaining board members resigned. The lake grew quieter. Not just because of the season, but because no one was patrolling it anymore. No one filing complaints because a kid's canoe was the wrong color. No one threatening fines over porch lights or mailbox paint, just neighbors. Living, I went back to fishing, same dock, same cast. Only now, when I looked across the water at the houses surrounding the shoreline, I didn't have to wonder who owned what. They all knew. And none of them would forget it. By the start of summer, the lake had taken on a new kind of stillness, not quiet, not empty, just settled. The kind of peace that follows a storm you weren't sure was ever going to end. Without Clarinda's shadow looming over every backyard and board vote, Lakewood Shores had turned a corner. You could see it in the small things. Kids playing in yards without being hurried inside at dusk, patios with string lights left up past the so-called lighting curfew, and the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing across the water. But just as the calm returned, something else surfaced. It came in the form of a subpoena. It showed up in my mailbox, delivered by hand from a county official who looked too nervous to make eye contact. The subpoena was addressed to me, requiring my appearance at a pre-trial hearing for a sealed charge, one that hadn't appeared on Clarinda's initial indictment list. The date was in 4 days. I called Yvette Monroe that evening. She picked up on the first ring. "You saw it," she said before I even introduced myself. I did. "What's this about?" She hesitated, then spoke carefully. The forensic audit turned up a second account, not an HOA account, a private one. It was used to funnel payments from a company called Lakeside Services LLC. Ever heard of them? No, they don't exist, not legally, but the payments match entries labeled Shoreline Maintenance in the HOA's books. We believe Clarinda created a shell vendor to siphon funds. I leaned against the door frame, staring out at the water, and I'm a witness because you're the only property owner whose land she repeatedly targeted under the guise of shoreline upkeep. If we can tie her fake expenditures to your property, we can prove intent to defraud not just the HOA but the county. What does that charge look like? Felony. Minimum sentence of 5 years. I agreed to testify. The courthouse was a squat brick building tucked between the county tax office and a shuttered hardware store. Inside, the pre-trial hearing was already underway when I arrived. A deputy waved me through the metal detectors, and within minutes, I was seated in a small, windowless room across from a defense attorney I didn't recognize and a court reporter who barely looked up from her machine. Clarinda wasn't present. Her counsel claimed she was in medical evaluation. No one pressed the issue. Yvette entered with a single folder in hand and addressed the magistrate directly. The witness owns the only non-HOA parcel adjacent to Lakewood Shores. The defendant filed no fewer than 6 false work orders referencing his property, charging the HOA nearly $30,000 over 18 months. None of that work occurred. The magistrate turned to me. "Mr. Kolman, did you at any time authorize Clarinda Carson or any representative of the HOA to perform maintenance on your land?" "No," I said. "Not once. Were you ever notified such work would be conducted?" "No." "Did you observe any evidence of landscaping, shoreline management, or structural services being performed?" "No, and I own every inch of that shoreline." I maintain it myself. Yvette handed him several photographs I'd taken over the last 2 years' time, stamped, geotagged, and stored in a hard drive I'd kept in the garage just in case. The magistrate flipped through them and gave a small nod. Noted for the record. The hearing ended quickly after that. Clarinda's attorney requested a continuance, but the judge denied it. The fraud charge was formally added to her case. 2 weeks later, I was called back, this time for the actual trial. The courtroom was fuller than I expected. Local reporters filled the back row, notebooks ready. A few familiar faces from the neighborhood sat to one side, whispering behind their hands. Clarinda entered through a side door, thinner than I remembered, her hair pulled back tight. She didn't look at anyone, not even her own attorney. When the charges were read, she didn't flinch. Wire fraud, forgery of public records, impersonation of a public official, and now felony embezzlement. I was called to the stand on the third day. Yvette guided me through the timeline, asking about the sequence of events, my discovery of the Shoreline flags, the trail cam footage, the fake invoice, and finally, the non-existent maintenance work. Mr. Kolman, to your knowledge, did any funds from the HOA ever impact your land, positively or otherwise? No. In fact, their only impact was attempting to restrict access and falsely claim authority. And had Clarinda Carson succeeded in folding your land into the HOA, what would the likely result have been? She would have had legal cover to charge me for services I never wanted and never received. And she would have used those charges to justify seizing control. The defense tried to poke holes, claimed I had a personal vendetta or that I'd embellished the HOA's actions, but the evidence was too clean. The documents spoke for themselves. On the 7th day, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in state prison with no chance of early release. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA members every dollar she took, plus interest. The fake vendor account was seized and civil suits began piling up within hours of the verdict. That should have been the end of it. But as it turned out, Clarinda wasn't the only one who'd been hiding things. The forensic audit had opened more than one door. The county discovered that the HOA's former vice president, someone who'd resigned quietly a year prior, had signed off on several of Clarinda's unauthorized expenditures. While he wasn't charged criminally, he was barred from serving on any community board or financial committee for the next 15 years. The remaining board members resigned voluntarily, and a neighborhood-wide vote was held to decide what to do with the leftover HOA funds. After legal fees and repayments, there was just under $90,000 remaining. They split it evenly among the homeowners. Each household received a check for a little under $800. When mine arrived, I framed it. Not because I needed the money, though it was satisfying, but because it was proof that sometimes the system actually worked. Summer ended with a neighborhood celebration. No permits, no rules, just a potluck on the lakefront. People brought folding tables, slow cookers, lawn chairs. Someone set up a Bluetooth speaker and played old rock songs while kids darted between campfires and makeshift marshmallow stations. For the first time in a long while, no one looked over their shoulder before starting a conversation. No one worried about whether their chairs were regulation height or if their garden gnomes were visible from the street. At one point, Daryl Atwood approached me with a paper plate loaded with barbecue. "You ever think this would happen?" he asked. "Not in a million years," he nodded toward the water. "You saved this place." I shook my head. "I just didn't let them take what wasn't theirs. Same thing." He walked off, leaving me alone at the edge of the dock. The moon was high, casting long silver streaks across the lake. I sat down, cracked open a cold beer, and listened to the sound of frogs along the shore. No clipboards, no warnings, no flags, just peace. And the knowledge that no matter how loud someone screams, they can't take what doesn't belong to them, especially if you're ready to fight back.